Hey everyone, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and local guy who thinks pecan pie is the best kind of pie. I'm sorry, pumpkin pie is just a little bit mid, blinchly. In today's episode, part 2 of our book chat about Barber's McWorld. Let's just get right into it. We'll start off with a brief little recap about the really cheerful stuff we talked about last time. Barber's basic premise is that there are two forces currently battling it out over the future of America and the world as a whole. One of those forces is McWorld, which is basically all the big multinational corporations and billionaires that want to destroy all these annoying sovereign forces like states, courts, regulations, national borders, etc., and just turn the whole world into one unified, 100% free market. This implies more than just the literal act of commerce. McWorld is also bound up in a particular cultural and political outlook, one where people are conceptualized as consumers making choices between products rather than citizens with political rights. Given the state of international commerce and international politics, McWorld has a distinctly Americanish soft culture kind of flavor. Think Levi's, Big Macs, Coca-Cola, and pop music. Now, rising up in opposition to this force is a response Barber calls jihad, but I call tribalism, both for algorithmic reasons. I do post these on YouTube. And also because I genuinely think the term jihad does a poor job of describing the full spectrum of groups Barber is referring to when he uses that term. Basically, tribalism is made up of all the little religious, cultural, racial, ethnic, political, or other regressive groups that are using an in-group, out-group dynamic as a way of trying to slow McWorld's creep. By unifying around some locally relevant element, say religious values or race, tribalism tries to break off a little piece of the globe and say, sorry, only in-group people can come in, no gross globalist values from McWorld. Unlike McWorld, which is distinctly and uniformly American in flavor, tribalism has all kinds of disparate groups under its umbrella. Everything from a radical Islamic terrorist to a Catalonian separatist to a Hindu nationalist to an America First modern conservative falls under the banner of tribalism. Whereas the end state of McWorld is one giant, unified, and unregulated market with no internal boundaries, the end state of tribalism is a world shattered into a million different pieces separated by boundaries, each piece unified around a shared racial or political or religious or historical characteristic. Infighting would be constant in these little pieces, and so would fighting between the pieces. To be clear, while McWorld and tribalism are currently locked in a struggle, McWorld is definitely winning. The current momentum of the world is trending towards further globalization, further accumulation of capital into the hands of a politically connected few, further breaking down of regulatory or other boundaries in deference to the rule of a few multinational corporations and extremely wealthy individuals. 300 years ago, the concept of a world culture or universal consumer identity would have seemed ridiculous, impossible. Nowadays, when you can fly to different countries in less time than it takes to go for a hike, when the internet allows people from all over the world to communicate and conduct commerce instantaneously without regard for borders, when goods like American or Korean pop music and Japanese cartoons and Italian food are approaching ubiquity no matter where you are, we are approaching ever closer to McWorld. Further complicating this dynamic, this tension between tribalism and McWorld, is that while the two are opposing forces, they are also sometimes self-reinforcing, or capable of providing simultaneous motivations to political actors. For example, McWorld can take advantage of tribalism values or unifying characteristics, parasitizing on them as a way to push product. Thus, your multinationally owned and produced beer might be draped in your country's flag around the time of your national holiday, or you might be marketed authentically Chinese, Mexican, Russian, etc. goods. Meanwhile, tribalism can use McWorld's advancements and technologies against it, such as by using the internet to discover and unite new political groups, or waging violent resistance using drones or 3D printed modifications to firearms. And politicians like Trump can simultaneously be totally McWorld aligned while simultaneously pushing for tribalist policies like tariffs as trade boundaries or anti-immigration. Barber makes very clear, and I completely agree, that both McWorld and tribalism fucking suck. This is not a good versus bad situation. We don't want to live in an America where all regulation and state boundaries and real citizenship has gone away in favor of pure, unrestrained hyper-capital, where the only scope of choice is Coke versus Pepsi. And we also don't want to live in an America that has been shattered into hundreds of little violent, regressive, prejudiced, and tyrannical subunits. But unless some other force, some other way of being is identified, Barber and I worry that we're going to be pulled into the unwelcome embrace of either McWorld or tribalism. And that is not a future that you, I, or Barber should be willing to accept. So what's the solution? Last episode I said something like, oh boy, you'll never guess. Barber says that. Barber, fuck. I'm leaving that in. Fuck it, it's my podcast. I can do it if I want. Okay, let me start over on that point. Last episode I said something like, oh boy, you'll never guess. Barber says that localism is the way to avoid falling into either McWorld or tribalism. Who could have predicted? And yeah, that is true. But I may have been making things seem a little bit simpler than they actually are. And while I do think that Barber's pitch and my localist pitch have some very real similarities, they also definitely have some differences. So you might remember from last episode that I described Barber as a global thinking guy at heart. When he sees global trends like McWorld or tribalism, his instinct is to match up with a solution that's equally as global in scale. There's going to be a lot of reading out of selections from the book in this episode. So here's the first one. Barber says, quote, democracy demands new post-nation-state institutions and new attitudes more attentive to the direct responsibility people bear for their liberties. To be sure, global government, above all democratic global government, remains a distant dream. But the kinds of global citizenship necessary to its cultivation are less remote. Lots to unpack here. First, we see that what Barber sees as the path that avoids McWorld and tribalism is small d democracy. That's a feature of localism too. But it's telling that Barber conceptualizes this democracy as being global in scale. It's a democracy where the whole world is acting together somehow in concert, and presumably under the bonds of some joint limitation of local sovereignty. This is what Barber sees as ideal. Second, we see that Barber ideally wants the whole world to basically become one unified government. Sure, he says, okay, yeah, that's not really realistic right now, but maybe we can try and create some kind of global citizenship identity that could eventually give rise to a global democracy. And I think this combination of democracy and globalism with each other is a perfect little encapsulation of the complicated ways that localism and Barber's philosophy are connected and disparate. On the one hand, yeah, we both agree that the way forward is to make governance more democratic, to give average people more of a say in what happens in their political lives. Barber even precedes this little blurb in favor of global government with a selection that could be right out of a textbook on localist political theory. In order to rescue our civil institutions and governments from either being eroded by McWorld or captured by tribalism, Barber says we have to, quote, make government our own by, quote, recasting our civil attitudes, which is possible only in a vibrant civil society where rights and responsibilities are joined together in a seamless web of community self-government. But despite this apparent commitment to community self-government and local self-determination, he then goes on to wax poetic about a potential world government and global identity. Like, huh? Keep in mind this strange tension, because we're about to hear Barber say a lot more stuff that sounds very much like localist theory. But it's always going to be complicated by Barber's preference for global scale solutions. Barber does see local democracy and a vibrant local civil society as being inherently good, but he also views them as stepping stones rather than an end goal in themselves. To him, recapturing local institutions and rendering them more democratic is simply part of a process that he hopes will prepare a civic space that can then be extended to cover a form of global democracy. If you wanted to be a bit unfair, you could say that Barber's theory views localism as just a necessity, something that you need to get through and move beyond as a way of achieving his ideal global democratic solution. He pretty much acknowledges this perspective outright by framing his inquiry in the following way, quote, the creation of a public is the task of civil society. Only there are attitudes likely to emerge that favor democracy and counter the siren song of McWorld. Only there are communities possible that hand the human need for parochial interaction in ways that remain open to inclusion and to cosmopolitan civic sentiments. But how can civic society be constructed in an international arena? Okay, so Barber wants to make things more democratic on the ground level so we can eventually build up to the global democracy he sees as the way to avoid McWorld and tribalism. So how does he suggest we start getting that local democracy rolling? Why, quite a few ways, all of which I'm going to repeat at length because they helpfully contain lots of localist talking points. Here's a nice few selections that even manage to zero in on America, which is something Barber doesn't always do, at least in this book. This is going to be kind of long, fair warning. Quote, battered by history and squeezed between two equally elephantine state and private market sectors, civil society has fairly vanished both as theory and as democratic practice. Even in America, where the heritage of John Locke ought to have kept it supple, it's kind of a gross way to describe it, the idea of civil society has petrified and crumbled. Its drive remains easily pushed aside in favor of a set of simple interlocking oppositions. The state versus the individual, government versus the private sector, public bureaucracy versus free markets, corrupt politicians versus angry voters. Politically alienated and consumption-weary people, equally uncomfortable with what they see as a rapacious and unsympathetic government, and a fragmented and self-absorbed private sector, find themselves homeless. Neither the market nor the state bureaucracy seems to speak to them or serve them in their public identity. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty fair description of the national mood at the moment. Barber says we have to get away from this mood by moving, quote, beyond the two-celled model of government versus private sector we have come to rely on. Instead, invoking the traditional language of civil society, we need to think about the domains people occupy as they go about their daily business, as having three arenas, whether within tribal enclaves, nation-states, or a global society. The three arenas are the government and the private sector, to be sure, but also the civil domain. And how does Barber define or describe the civil domain? Well, quote, civil society or civic space occupies the middle ground between government and the private sector. It is not where we vote, and it is not where we buy and sell. It is where we talk with neighbors about a crossing guard, plan a benefit for a community school, discuss how our church or synagogue can shelter the homeless, or plan a softball league for our children. In this domain, we are public beings and share with the government a sense of publicity and a regard for the general good and the commonwealth. But unlike government, we make no claim to exercise a monopoly on legitimate coercion. Rather, we work here voluntarily and, in this sense, inhabit a private realm devoted to the cooperative, non-coercive pursuit of public goods. This neighborly and cooperative domain of civil society shares with the private sector the gifts of liberty. It is voluntary and constituted by freely associated individuals and groups. But unlike the private sector, it aims at common ground and consensual, that is, integrative and collaborative modes of action. Civil society, thus, is public without being coercive, voluntary without being privatized. It is in this domain that our traditional civic institutions can be found, such as foundations, schools, churches, public interest, and other voluntary civic associations properly belong. Note that despite the references to voting and a coercive public sector here and not wanting a claim to coercion, I read Barber as referencing coercive big, small r Republican government here, and voting as literally casting a ballot for candidates rather than casting a vote as part of democratic self-rule. Local government, though technically public in character, fits in very comfortably with the other types of organizations Barber mentions in his laundry list of traditional civic institutions. And I'm also convinced that he sees local government as part of his civil society because of something he writes later, something that is arguably the most strikingly localist stuff Barber says in the entire book. Quote, throughout the 19th century, in de Tocqueville's America, side note, I may do a book chat series on de Tocqueville's Democracy in America someday, it's a fascinating read. Anyway, in Tocqueville's America and afterwards, American society felt like civil society. Without trying to romanticize the social conditions of that decentralized period, we can see how they allowed liberty a more local and civil aspect, while a modest governmental sphere and an unassuming private sector were overshadowed by an extensive civic network tied together by schools, granges, no idea what a grange is, by the way, churches, town halls, village greens, country stores, and voluntary associations of every imaginable sort. It was these municipal institutions that fired Tocqueville's imagination. So, hey, if Tocqueville's America was an America with a robust civic society, and the thing that undergirded that version of America was meaningful participation in local government institutions like schools and town halls, and also some non-political institutions like churches, it sure sounds like Barber is saying straight out that his civil society solution to McWorld and tribalism is to empower local governments and incentivize citizens' direct participation in them. One more quote to really drive home the point that this pre-global democracy transitional step Barber proposes is basically localism, and that he views localism as the way to create a civil society that provides a viable way to avoid either McWorld or tribalism. Quote, not so long after the Committees of Correspondence inaugurated their successful revolution against English tyranny, Thomas Jefferson had proposed local civic assemblies as a continuation of direct and decentralized self-government. Where every man is a sharer in the direction of his ward republic, he had written, and feels that he is a participator in the government of affairs not merely at an election one day in the year, but every day, When there shall not be a man in the state who will not be a member of one of its councils, great or small, he will let the heart be torn out of him sooner than his power be wrested from him. Only at the local and regional levels, where tribalism plays out its game, can an alternative form of identity be one that ultimately can contain McWorld at the global level. Man, old TJ really was an incredible thinker. Shame about the slaves and all the rape. Anyway, time to stop copy-pasting from the PDF I have open and actually provide a little bit of independent analysis. Here's my analysis. I pretty much agree with everything Barber is saying here. Throwing out all this jargon about McWorld and tribalism and civil society, here's basically what Barber is saying. We aren't being served either by market forces or our current political representatives. In order to make things better, we need to make America more democratic. And in order to make it more democratic, we need to focus more in on local democracy, local self-determination, the kind of self-governance that allows and even forces people to go out and grapple with the problems in their community themselves. And importantly, they're grappling with these problems with their own hands, and with themselves and their neighbors. You'll be forced to grapple with each other when you disagree, deal with each other directly, and potentially even face-to-face in a democratic forum. This kind of mood, this kind of ethic of direct political participation and direct political responsibility and open accepted forums for disagreement is the civil society that Barber wants to create. And it's exactly the kind of environment that localism wants to create too. Of course, this form of civic society isn't possible, and your self-determination isn't all that meaningful unless you actually have the power to decide things for yourself, which is why localism is all caught up in changing the structure of authority in America to give local government, the very place civic society rests on, a much broader warrant of power. Barber doesn't say he's for this directly, but I'd argue that he'd definitely agree that giving localities more power is a logical extension of his desire to create civil society, as are democratic reforms to make local government's governing procedures more democratic. Now let's take a moment to consider how a localist structure of government in America, a Barber-like civil society, would help provide a defense against both tribalism and McWorld. On the tribalism side, it's my belief, and it is a belief because tribalism is a lot about belief and feeling and sentiment, that the reason people embrace stuff like religious or cultural or racial or whatever hatred as a barrier against the unknown, unwanted, and uncontrollable is at least in part because hatred can feel in the moment like agency. When you can pretend that the world is cast in easy shades of black and white, and when you can convince yourself that all you need to do to solve all your problems is simply destroy the right enemy or force, you feel empowered. That's not a happy fact, but it is true. And the reason people run towards that hatred, that empowerment, that false agency, is because they've been denied control and agency in the parts of their lives that matter, including the political arena. When market forces beyond your control capture political machines over and above anything in your life, suddenly your values and preferences don't even matter when it comes to your own backyard. You stand powerless as these big looming corporations and corrupt politicians make all these decisions, the consequences of which creep into your life whether you want them to or not. In the face of this, simply turning to anger and pushing back against those forces using nationalism, racism, religious superiority, etc., can be a tempting path by which to, emotionally, subjectively at least, feel as though you're recapturing that self-determination that you've lost. That path of tribalism is still wrong, and it still won't actually get you what you want. McWorld will still win, or you'll just end up destroying yourself or your community to create a regressive hellhole. But it feels like you're carving out a little space for freedom. And in a time where feeling has become increasingly more important and increasingly more verifiable than fact, that feeling of freedom is intoxicating. But localism and Barber civil society prevent the conditions that compel you towards the false tonic of tribalism in the first place. When you have the ability to make binding decisions about your own community, to debate and discuss with visible people, knowable people, your neighbors and friends, rather than needing to deal with some abstraction on the internet or some hostile person 1,000 miles away, when your losses come about not because you've been subordinated to a distant mass of people or a distant mass of capital, but because you simply aren't in the majority within your own community. When the American political structure is rearranged so that the power of self-determination lies in every community's own hands, rather than in the hands of compromised politicians in distant state capitals and the federal capital, then you are never in a position where change is solely a function of external forces beyond your control. And when your political agency actually matters, can translate into an immediate and demonstrable effect, that feeling of meaning and of freedom is more potent than anything tribalism or other regressive forces will ever be able to produce. I don't have facts or a fancy political theory or whatever to back this up, so I'm just going to say this is my fervent and genuine belief. In communities where your political actions translate into quantifiable outcomes and where self-rule is the norm rather than subjection to distant powers, tribalism has much more difficulty taking root. So how about McWorld? How do localist reforms / Barber's local civil society help keep those forces at bay? Simple. Decentralization is anathema to McWorld. Remember that what McWorld wants is basically one big unified world with one big unified culture and one big unified body of customers buying one big unified body of shared products. That's why McWorld in some ways actually prefers large, powerful, and distant governments that control everything from the top down. When all you need to do in order to capture government and start deregulating is, get one president elected or 5 senators, then assuming you're a big multinational corporation with billions at your disposal, it's actually pretty easy to get control of the would-be governing authorities. And the politicians who tend to thrive in these big top-down governments, in other words, tend to thrive in America, don't give a shit about the dangerous or unwanted effects of McWorld. Hell, these kinds of politicians are McWorld, are overwhelmingly richer and more embedded with corporate forces and more cosmopolitan than your average American. And that cosmopolitan stuff can apply to conservative federal or state politicians too. The old guard conservatives are very concerned with things like free trade between nations and NATO as an enforcement body for keeping international trade lines open. Even the new America First crowd suddenly gets pretty internationalist the moment we start talking about Israel or Taiwan or Saudi Arabia. And oftentimes these internationalist arguments boil down to why political supporters make money in that region and would make less money if there was economic or cultural change. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that McWorld loves centralized governments because they break down barriers and make it efficient to act as the real power behind the throne. But that bag of tricks doesn't work. When instead of one centralized government, you've got thousands of self-ruling local governments all across America where decisions are made by ordinary people voting small d democratically rather than elected representatives who come from the worst parts of elite society. Now you need to actually convince people everywhere that whatever you're selling makes sense in their own backyards, and they're going to be free to reject your pitch if they aren't interested. Plus, McWorld hates democracy, because democracy lets just anybody play a part in making political decisions, whereas small r republicanism only allows those who can win a war of resources, i.e. a political campaign, into the halls of power. And when money is the gate, it's always McWorld who's going to be standing there ready with the key. Plus, unlike big money federal or state politicians who don't really have to care about whether or not McWorld rules everything because they're going to profit if that happens, ordinary people are going to be less inclined to do insane things just because it makes some rich shareholders a few extra bucks. And when those ordinary people have the power, they're going to use it in ways that benefit the common good, even if they're bad for business, which is also bad for McWorld. On the more normative end, remember that McWorld is all about culture because culture can breed commerce. The basic sale point of McWorld is that, oh boy, when I have lots of products to choose between, that means I have lots of freedom. That's right, folks. You're the most free when you can spend the money on the stuff that you want and get it quickly. Freedom doesn't mean anything else. Don't get any silly ideas in your little heads. This narrative is way more difficult to sell when people actually get to experience true freedom and true choice in their political lives, can make meaningful decisions within their own communities about issues that matter to them. That's what localism is all about. And it's what Barber's civil society is all about too, at least on this local initial level. Okay, that's all the buddy-buddy stuff out of the way. Now it's time to get into where Barber starts to lose me a bit, and that's with his desire to not just be content with these efforts at local or regional democracy, and instead turn democracy into a universalizing export that gives birth to a global form of shared government. To be fair, the way I've been describing his global views on this matter, you might think that Barber wants us to all, right out the gate, be under the thumb of some kind of centralized UN world parliament that rules us all from afar. And that's not the case. He's got something pretty different in mind. Quote, "How is a world integrated by markets but otherwise utterly disintegral to be held together if not by global government and unmediated international law, neither of which I've suggested hold out realistic promise? The primary form of reorganization in recent years, thanks to the politics of tribalism, has been partition. What is the alternative? Federalism is probably too aggressive and centralist a solution." If federalism doesn't work, then what does Barber think would work as a form of world democratic government? He answers, quote, "Confederalism offers a more promising strategy, for it permits the nation states already in existence to create, bottom up, a global association." Let's talk briefly about these two words that Barber has just thrown around and played off one another: federalism and confederalism. Federalism is a form of government where multiple subunits are ruled by a relatively strong central authority. The subunits retain a certain amount of inherent authority and perhaps even some limited degree of self-rule, but are ultimately largely subject to the central government's rule. Confederalism is a form of government that is like federalism inasmuch as there's a power-sharing agreement between a joint government and constituent subunits, but the balance of power lies very much with the subunits rather than the joint government. What imposes this different balance of power is that the relationship between the subunits and the joint government is defined by consent within confederalism. Unlike confederalism, in confederalism, continued subunit membership in the joint government is entirely voluntary, meaning withdrawal is a legitimate possibility. In particularly decentralized confederalist systems, the joint government's actions or edicts may amount to mere suggestions that member subunits are free to embrace or disregard as they see fit. In stronger confederalist systems, the joint government may still retain exclusive and binding authority in areas that demand quick and unified responses, like foreign affairs or military matters or environmental standards. But as you can see, the line between confederalism and federalism can get a bit blurry. Though as mentioned before, the best way to tell them apart is usually to see whether the constituent parts within a government have the right to withdraw from the joint government, that's confederalism, or if they have no right to leave, federalism. America is most certainly a federalist government. And let's get this out of the way too. When you hear the term confederalism, you are probably thinking of that rebellion of racists and slavers called the Confederacy. To be clear, confederalism is not an idea that has anything to do with the ideas that the Confederacy was espousing. It was obviously advantageous for the Confederates to brand themselves as, oh, we like confederalism, because one basic tenet of confederalism is that the subunits of a central government have the right to withdraw if they want at any time, and that's exactly what all of these people down in the South were trying to do because they hated the idea of not being able to have slaves anymore. However, confederalism really just is a political system where subunits aren't subject to the strong rule of a central joint government. That's it. It doesn't have anything to do with the Confederacy more broadly. And one of the reasons we know that that's not the case is because way before the Civil War even happened, America could arguably have been called a Confederalist government. Our first founding document, the one that we had before the Constitution, was literally called the Articles of Confederation, and it set out exactly the kind of Confederalist government before we eventually rejected it in favor of a constitution that trumped all state law and a federalist form of government. Barber is well aware of America's connection to and initial flirtation with confederalism. In fact, he's more than aware of it. He's taking up the interesting but definitely unusual position that the Articles of Confederation could serve as the basis for an initial form of international relation. Or at least, I think that's what he's saying. You be the judge. First, he shits on the Federalist Papers a little bit, which kind of rules because people glaze that stuff way too much. Quote, "The Federalist Papers have been required reading for desperate governments seeking to slow the pace of partition and civil disintegration. The Articles of Confederation make far more relevant reading." Why? Well, to Barber, Article 3 of the Articles, in conjunction with a revitalization of civil society locally, provides a modest framework for holding rival national fragments together into a loose alliance. So let's take a peek at Article 3 of the Articles of Confederation. Article 3 says, "The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with one another for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense whatsoever." Okay, I'm sure you have several thoughts about this modest linkage, but we're almost done summing up Barber's ideas on this point, so hold them for now. Let's conclude with Barber making the point of all his theorizing clear. Quote, "Strong democracy needs citizens. Citizens need civil society. Civil society requires a form of association not bound by identity politics. That form of association is democracy. Or, global democracy needs confederalism, a non-compulsory form of association rooted in friendship and mutual interest. Confederalism depends on member states that are well-rooted in civil society and on citizens for whom the other is not synonymous with the enemy. Civil society and citizenship are products of the democratic way of life." So there we go. First, democracy may be worldwide through localism. Then we can all come together under the merry bonds of American-flavored confederalism, agreeing to defend each other against intrusions before eventually we find our cooperation so wonderful that we, again like America, maybe decide to cast aside confederalism in favor of a stronger and more unifying federalist global government. Yippee! We're getting close to the end of this episode now, and what better way to end things off than with some griping? As I mentioned before, when it comes to the problems we are currently facing in America, I agree so strongly with so much of what Barber says. I think that McWorld and tribalism are genuine forces at play in contemporary American politics. I think the way he sets them up in opposition to each other is a legitimate frame by which to evaluate current conflicts. I think that both of them are serious threats, and we don't want either McWorld or tribalism to win. I think that Barber is exactly on point when he says the way to counter this is through the resurrection of local authority and local self-determination, so as to create a civil space, a civil society that provides more fulfillment than either McWorld or tribalism are capable of. But all this stuff about then viewing this enhancement of local agency as just the first part of a process that culminates in a centralized global government, he totally loses me. The whole point of embracing civil society and small d democracy is that it keeps people away from tribalism's divisive predations while still allowing people to maintain a sense of local identity that protects against McWorld's cold universalization. Why would we then try to transform that constructive civil local identity into something that, just like McWorld, is essentially a universalization? Plus, one of the criticisms that Barber himself levels at McWorld is that it attempts to import a distinctly American-flavored set of culture and values that eventually supplant local uniqueness. And his solution to this problem is to look to the Articles of Confederation, a distinctly American innovation, as something to import to other countries in the world and supplant their ordinary self-rule? Sure, maybe that self-rule is protected somewhat by the initial confederal form, but it still looks like Barber is kind of providing a cure that shares much of the same flaws as the ill it seeks to ameliorate. And despite Barber's assurances, Article 3 of the Articles of Confederation seems to pose a much stronger bond between member states than that of mere cooperation or mutual tolerance, which maybe is the most we can expect at the global level. After all, any nations that have just bound themselves together through Article 3 have just committed to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them or any of them in order to provide for their common defense. That's the literal language of Article 3. And so Barber's big idea is to basically try and make a new military alliance on the big stage, one that maybe is or maybe isn't contiguous with America's current military alliances such as NATO. Even if we did agree with Barber that some sort of international democratic movement is desirable and viable, do we really want to bind that movement to forms of America-flavored military guarantees that are sure to piss off nations that might otherwise be willing to consider small d democracy? Look, call me an isolationist or a hater or whatever, but we have seen what happens when America gets ideas in its head about exporting its political systems abroad. The results have almost never been good. Same with America jumping headfirst into international mutual defense pacts. That might be a good way to reassure international capital that trade lanes will stay open, but have the ever-looming potential of sending young American men and women off to die on foreign soils against enemies that present no actual threat to anyone in America. Basically, I'm just plain skeptical about Barber's idea that America should be focused on the issue of global government, that we should assume it's somehow our responsibility to export our ideas abroad or encourage people to follow whatever democratic example we're setting at home. Instead, I think the best path forward is for America to focus inward, to grapple with the serious issues that are dividing our people, and to start reorganizing our domestic political structure to create the local democratic institutions that Barber would agree are key to avoiding McWorld and tribalism. Let's stop being the world police or world democracy bringers and start thinking a little bit more about our local libraries and volleyball fundraisers and food pantries. To me, that's the real way to resist McWorld's cold culture of commercial calculation while also rejecting the hateful division of tribalism. Boy, wasn't that all fun? Don't you all just love books? I sure hope so, because we are still very much in book chat territory, baby. 10 million years book chat. Book chat has the mandate of heaven. We've now completed our little foray into Barber's McWorld, but I've got something real special for you next time. Imagine a book all about making local government more powerful and more democratic. Imagine a book that waxes poetic about the power and desirability of small d direct democracy. Imagine a book that is focused on the practical and legal issues surrounding reform of local authority. Sounds pretty great, right? Now imagine me complaining about that book a ton and putting lots of effort into pointing out why I think most of the ideas it presents could be seen as bad shit. Get excited! Our next episode will be part 1 of our book chat into Beale and Bookchin's The Politics of Social Ecology, Libertarian Municipalism. I'll see you then. Oh, almost forgot. If you like what you're hearing here and want to enjoy our future book chat, why not give us a follow on Spotify? We also post episodes on YouTube and lots of shorts, which actually are the way that most people view this content. So I'd recommend going and subscribing there too if you want to stay up to date on whatever I'm releasing next. I also would love to respond to your questions and comments at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist with a T, pod@gmail.com.
A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.